Now back to Site C Dam, you have the WAC Bennett Dam up there already, and you have another dam that's up there. And so when I listen to the government trying to justify why it wants to further infringe upon this group of First Nations rights, they're saying, well, so you can't hunt here anymore, but you can still hunt over here. So it's not that great an infringement on your rights. And so I started to think along the lines of where is there space recognizing the accumulation of infringements and the cumulative impact on our First Peoples? Because when they put the first dam in, there was no duty to consult, so they completely disregarded the hunting and trapping and so on of the First Nations. So they couldn't do it there anymore. Then this next dam pops up. They can't do their activities there anymore neither. And so now the government further wants to restrict where they can exercise their rights by building a third dam. And so I started to think about it. I thought, so now they can't hunt here or fish there, and they have to go way over to this other place. And so I said to the panel, I said, you know, it's much like telling people in Richmond that you have to go to Chilliwack to go shopping now. And it's not that big a deal. At least you have somewhere to go and get what you need. And so I was trying to bring it down to a model or a description where actually they could really accept what these impacts are. They're not simply just a list of rights that we're going to be infringed and no worries, you can do it over here still. It's the difference between shopping at Save On Foods or doing your shopping at 7-Eleven. You can still get basically the same things, but the cost is a lot more. And this is something that we face in our community because our clam beds are right outside around our territories, right next to our village. But when you have fish farms there that are fouling up the beaches, we wind up having to travel further away to gather our resources. So it's an additional cost to ourselves, which is never considered in terms of the viability of the industry or the actual profit margins. Now the government has wonderful ways to pretend that things are really worthwhile. When you look at fish farms, as an example, they talk about the profits that it makes. That this is such a great addition to the economy of Canada. Well, if I was involved in an industry where I didn't have to be responsible for any aspect of the waste produced by my activity, of course I'm going to appear profitable. But if the government were to impose upon this particular industry that they must take care of all the waste that comes out of a fish farm where there's 750,000 fish, it would add an additional cost, which I don't think is out of line to expect someone to be responsible for their activities. Certainly we as Canadians have to be responsible for our activities with the law. If you're like me, you get a lot of speeding tickets and you need to respect that. But the challenge that I see is this effort of unity amongst First Nations people. Because when I think about the Enbridge pipeline, ideally, if they could have land use plans for each First Nation along the path and to provide the resources for First Nations to develop that, where they could crystallize what it is that they see as their rights. And so they could put levels of importance upon the various rights and places along this trail of the pipeline. And then they could have First Nations get together and somewhat harmonize those land use plans all the way across. And so now the government can go forward in good conscience, knowing that they've spoken with all First Nations, they've provided the resources to do the work, they've looked for a harmonized approach, and now we're not pitting one nation against another. But since the 209 recommendations, like that isn't a clear signal enough that there's something seriously wrong with this project. But now they have potentially a 6-month decision window. And so what happens then, we're going to have a government that's not going to be able to provide the resources, time, or space for one First Nation to develop a land use plan. They're certainly not going to have a window of opportunity for First Nations to harmonize what it is that they see in relationship to this project. Now, when I was up at Site C Dam, or up in Fort St. John, you got to talk with the chief from Fort Nelson, and to get an idea of what impacts come out of fracking. You know, I like this natural gas. It makes it sound like it's such a great thing and it doesn't have any impact. But if you look into the amount and volume of water that gets put into the ground for fracking, it's absolutely beyond imagination. Now I saw in a presentation they talked about the BC Oil and Gas Industry Association, I think it was called. They reported out, I think it was in 2011, that they used up about 11 million liters of water. Now, just to put that in perspective, I mean, who can picture what 11 million liters looks like? I mean, I have got no concept about it. Until I was surfing around on the net, and I come across this picture of Westwood Lake, and that I believe is about 10 million liters. So in 1 year, the industry in BC used up all the water that's in Westwood Lake and then some. So when you start to think about extracting that level of water from this water system, you start to have some greater questions again about the profitability. Because what we're having is an offloading of the environmental costs. And the science that they have, or what they do with the water when they're finished, is they drill down extremely deep into the earth and put the water there, like that's going to be all okay. And another thing that I've just learned recently is the amount of carbon dioxide they need to push the water down into the fracking site. And so I mean, carbon is one of those great things that the government wants to. We have, carbon offset programs and wanting to ensure that we have a balance and carbon neutral. And yet this industry is going to be using vast amounts of this. So when we want to, as First Nations, stand up and protect our rights, and these are not, as I mentioned already, these are not just rights that we dream up, and these are not rights that we put in front of the government of Canada and Canadians to be difficult. We're talking about the human rights of a group of people in this world. Now, one of my elders that taught me how to sing, and it was interesting to be with my Uncle Michael when he was still with us. I thought he was teaching me about songs. And then I thought he was teaching me about our culture. But upon his passing, I realized that he was teaching me about life. And he was teaching me about respecting the stories of origin of our people. It's no different than any other race of people in this world. And Uncle Michael always said to me, he said, you have to remember one origin story is no better or more important than another. They all just are. And it was a way for him to tell me that we all must respect one another in a very deep way. And so now when we step forward as First Nations, we have to have a variety of tools to engage with the government. And of course, the First Nations capacity and the ability to have the technical staff to assist leadership is really hard to come by. With our First Nation, when we talk about the technical and legal capacity, that's me. We don't have a lot of educated people that have pursued things which are relevant to these discussions to protect our lands. So, is it fair for the government to do a process where they're well-resourced, the industry is well-resourced, and the peoples whose very human rights are going to be infringed upon do not get any resources? And those people are still a part of the fabric of Canada. And so when we have Section 35(1) of the Canadian Constitution that supposedly protects our Aboriginal rights, and Supreme Court of Canada that gives the government direction and they disregard it, I say to many people as possible, if you're interested in democracy, if you're interested in some measure of a report card on how well Canada is doing, I suggest to people that they really examine the First Nations experience with Canada today. Because I can't think of another group of people in Canada that need to, without question, have to engage at the constitutional level of this country, and also to embrace, understand, and implement Supreme Court of Canada rulings. And these are two very foundational instruments within Canada. And so when I say, when First Nations speak about the difficulties with it, that to me is a report card on how well democracy is going on in Canada. And so now, when we look at, I found it interesting, I don't know if you heard on the news about what's going on in the Ukraine, or Crimea, I think that's the name of it. Harper said that the government has to give back their land. I thought it was the irony of Stephen Harper over there saying you can't take land without the okay of the people that live there. Except in Canada, it's only Indians, it's good. To understand, I believe, for us, how do we understand how people view us? I watched, I bought a DVD off the National Film Board site, and it was called Real Injun. And have you seen that?
Yeah.
I mean, it was humorous, but to me it was so painful to realize that it's a comment on the majority of society's views of Indian peoples. Or if you've read Inconvenient Indian, I found that was another good read. And I'm not sure, how much time? Okay, because I want to leave time for us to have a discussion, because you've got stuff you can teach me too. I'm interested in that very much. But I'm not sure what books you read here or that are part of your course content. There's one that I really enjoy. There's 3 books. And I've lost count of how many of these I've bought because I give them to our youth to try and inspire them and try to give them the tools to get on with leadership. So there's The Prisons of Grass. I think his last name is Adams. Yeah, thank you. He was a half-breed Indian from the prairies. He went down to the University of Southern Cal, got his degree. And so Prisons of Grass, it talks about what I really enjoy about the book. It's not a victim-based, feel bad for me, this is how bad we had it. It's a very factual telling of the steps taken by government, industry, and church to subjugate First Nation people in Canada. And then you have Harold Cardinal's book, Unjust Society. And that's a comment of Canada at that point of evolution, that point where it was being forced to examine the Constitution and repatriate it, making space for First Nations people. And so that way you have an idea of where the current legal realities, where the genesis was. And then there's a more recent book. I know that my dear friend Louise Mandel was here earlier this week. Her and a couple of her colleagues wrote a book called The Empty Box of Treasures. And what it is, it's a description, very methodical description of the failings of Canada to fulfill Section 35(1) of the Constitution. So Prisons of Grass talks about how Canada began. Unjust Society talks about how First Nations began to take hold of ourselves in terms of how we interact with Canada. And Unjust Society captures how Canada continues to fail our people. And so I know you have a lot to read. I would suggest picking up those 3 books. They're great reads. And to have conversation with people in your world. And this is the biggest reason I come and speak when I can to groups such as this one, is because I want to have that dialogue. I want to be able to pass some information on, which I'm hoping will intrigue you to some degree. And remember, Google's your friend. You can look things up and do further reading. But it's that endless pursuit of information now, where I don't think, well, no, there has never been a time in history where we as average citizens have had such easy access to incredible amounts of data and resources and information. So when we make the choice not to do that, we make the choice to remain uninformed. And I think that we as individuals and as our families and communities, we deserve so much more to go out and seek that information. But now I'd like to open up the floor for questions.